We've all experienced this. We're playing Football Manager like normal, and then something bad happens. Maybe somebody gets hurt, maybe somebody just isn't playing well, and so you make a substitution. But have you ever wondered where the substitution rules come from? And did you know that substitutions in English football didn't actually become a thing until 1965? Did you know that the topic was really controversial for a long time? Let's do a deep dive today into that world of football substitutions, the controversy you probably have never heard about. Though the earliest laws of the game didn't state that substitutions were allowed, they were also not expressly disallowed. My guess is that this is why you occasionally find reports of substitutions in games played in the 1850s and 1860s. Now, you absolutely can find references to substitutions throughout the 1880s in football news reports if you look hard enough. However, you're probably going to wind up confused like I was, since both rugby and soccer were referred to as football at that time with really no distinction between them. Now, to put this into context, the number of players on each team and the duration of each match were not specified in the laws of the game until 1897. And the penalty kick itself wasn't specified in the rules until 1891. I guess we could say that the game was still in flux back in those days. Anyway, at some point in time, everybody simply decided that there would be no substitutes, and so there were no substitutes, and it stayed that way for decades. Sure, the subject was mentioned from time to time, such as in this small clipping about an FA meeting in April 1915, but the meetings had no real effect. Of course, most sports had strict limitations on substitutions at the time. Baseball, for example, only allowed one replacement per game for years in the 19th century. Shortly after the start of the 20th century, ice hockey did not allow for any substitutions at all except when players were injured, which is crazy. Substitutions in rugby weren't allowed until 1968, which is even more crazy. And famously, American football originally did not allow any substitutions at all, only relenting to allow limited substitutions after players started to die on the field. In other words, football isn't unique. Limited substitutions were just part of the nature of sport in the old days, but you might be a little surprised at some of the early discussions that took place about possible substitutions. For example, there were serious talks about substitutions in soccer in Canada as early as 1927. Now, the argument against substitutions was that good physical conditioning was a vital part of the game, and don't think this was a sport that was somehow different. Canadian newspapers routinely printed first, second, and third division results from England back in those days. The United States Football Association apparently allowed for the use of 2 substitutes in all games in 1929, though I haven't found very much more information about this. It's clear, though, that all of this talk was just mostly talking and theories that really didn't get anywhere. The semi-professional game in the United States actually had no real clear substitution rules that prompted articles like this one from Pittsburgh in 1950. Among the more bizarre stories from those days were tales of managers sneaking a 12th man onto the field without the referees ever noticing. But of course, that's the United States, where we barely even know how to play the game anyway. The more interesting thing here is the substitution discussion in England, and believe it or not, there actually was a discussion that went on for decades. This complaint in the Daily Mail about Chelsea's bad luck comes from April 1931. Chelsea finished 12th in the league that year. In making a case for substitutes, presumably because it might have helped Chelsea that season, the author specifically cites the practice of allowing substitutes in soccer in the United States. The more convincing argument, though, is that it was pretty inhumane to require injured players to stay on the pitch because of principle, manliness, or whatever the excuse was at the time. Manchester City goalkeeper Bert Trautmann famously stayed on the pitch for the 1956 FA Cup final despite suffering a broken neck. Trautmann had taken a blow to the neck from the knee of Peter Murphy with about 15 minutes left in the match. Now, Trautmann somehow managed to hold on to the end of the match, though he was obviously in considerable pain. In hindsight, it is unbelievable that he was able to make it despite that injury. While he was celebrated as a hero, he claimed not to remember anything about the end of the match, which is a really bad sign. The awful truth is that he had been very close to death, and I mean, it's just awful just to look at these headlines. You know, as much fun as the idea of being manly and sucking it up might be, the truth is that this was incredibly dangerous for professionals. It's also ridiculous to expect that a team should be at a disadvantage just because one of its players suffers a major or even life-threatening injury. And as you can imagine, this got the discussion about substitution going once again. It wouldn't surprise you to learn that there was talk of allowing substitutions almost immediately afterwards, for goalkeepers at least. Amazingly, though, most fans seem to be against the idea. When you look back on this debate, the arguments against substitution honestly seem a little bit silly. For example, there was this ridiculous claim that clubs would need to employ only goalkeepers, an exaggeration that makes no sense if you think about it. And there was also this constant worry that the substitution rule would be abused like it supposedly was on the continent. You see, there was at least some sort of history of substitution by that time in continental Europe. For example, there was a World Cup qualifying match in 1953 between West Germany and Switzerland where West Germany used a substitute. I think there might have been one or two other matches, but they were pretty rare. And of course, this was obviously proof that the players were being lazy and the teams were abusing the rule. The argument raged on for years, though the arguments against substitution seem mostly to have been some variety of "it's the way we've always done it." Even at the lowest levels of the sport, attempts to introduce substitution were swiftly defeated, never mind the fact that substitutes absolutely were a thing in the school game in 1860 and before. Those familiar with the sport in the United States and Canada seem to have had a more liberal view of the subject. And by late 1957, it was pretty obvious that FIFA was going to change the laws of the game to allow for substitutions. Extremely limited substitution was finally officially allowed by FIFA in 1958. Now, around 33 minutes into the first half of the 1959 FA Cup final, Roy Dwight broke his leg and had to leave the pitch. Nottingham Forest barely managed to hold on to the victory despite being down to 10 men. Dwight had scored a goal before breaking his leg. In retrospect, it really is bizarre that the club would have to suffer for his injury. Now, something really had to be done. That much is clear in hindsight. But you know, history kind of has this funny habit of sneaking up on you if you're not careful. It wasn't until late May 1965 that the Football League voted in favor of allowing substitutions, and by a large margin. This rule allowed for a single substitute and only a single man was permitted on the bench. The press certainly didn't care for the new rule and subtly implied that the rule had something to do with decreased attendance at the start of the 1965 season. But the league pressed on and even considered allowing for tactical substitutions despite the protestations of the Football Association. Well, that's the history of football for you. It's always about the Football Association battling it out with the Football League. Anyway, once that cat was let out of the bag, things really started to change. And honestly, the improvements in the sport over the years have probably because the players on the pitch were actually in good enough condition to play. Despite fierce opposition from a few notable clubs, the league did allow for substitution for a reason other than injury starting in August 1967. And it took a while, but finally in June 1987, the rule changed to allow for 2 substitutes in league matches. The bench started to grow with the coming of the Premier League, and the rest of it is history that is so recent that most of you probably already know it. But it's still just absolutely amazing to me that an injured player could not come off for a substitute as recently as like 1965. I mean, it's almost unfathomable. So keep that in mind the next time someone's injured in your Football Manager match. Imagine what it would be like if you couldn't take him off. Or if you have the guts to do this, head on into the pregame editor and just turn off substitutions by yourself. Yeah, see how long that one lasts. It would be a completely different game without substitutes, that's for sure.